Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Maddie, and today I'm going to be doing a video that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. It is my Stephen King collection. So, if you didn't know already, my favorite author of all time is Stephen King. I've been reading him ever since I was in middle school, believe it or not. I know it's a little strange to be able to say that, but I have read quite a few of his books throughout middle school and high school. And honestly, even when I had my little bit of a break from reading for a while, I was still trying to read his new books. So I've definitely read quite a few of them. I definitely haven't read all of them, but I own pretty much every book that he's written. Not the novellas. I've a lot of his ebooks and novellas I do not own, but most of his books I do own, as you can see from my bookshelf right here. Now, I'm not going to go through the specific books that I own because honestly I don't really have any like nice editions of his books other than 2 first editions and also a bunch of like the newer books from Domaki on. I do have all of those in hardcover when I bought them as they came out. But as far as the rest of them goes, they're either paperbacks that I've bought over at used bookstores or library sales or whatever you want, or also just like, you know, antique stores, or I just bought them at Barnes & Noble, whatever. So I don't believe that the specific books are worth really showing, although, so you have to like kind of take my word for it that I do own all of the books I'm going to talk about in this video. But honestly, the point is that I am a huge Stephen King fan. I have so many of his books. I've read so many of them, and I thought I would go through all of the books that I own. There might even be a few that I don't own, and also just kind of give you an idea of like, have I read them, have I not read them, do I really want to read them soon, and yeah, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. So I'm actually on Stephen King's website right now on my phone. So if you're wondering what I'm looking down at, it's my phone for his website. It has a list of all of his novels, novellas. It also has a bunch of like his essays, short stories, stuff that he's written for newspapers before he even became published. So it's a really cool website. I definitely would check that out. I'll leave it in the description below. But yeah, it just has a list of all of his books, and it has them in the order of publication date. So I thought that would be a good way for me to like kind of go through the list of books that I have, books that I've read, and books that I really want to read. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first book that he wrote was in 1974, and it was Carrie. Now, I haven't actually read Carrie, but I have seen the movie, so that is definitely one that I need to read, and I'm actually going to go ahead for fun and kind of have like a tracker right here of books that I have read and haven't read over here on the side, and just kind of give you an idea of like how much, even though I'm a huge Stephen King fan, how many books I still really do need to get to. And then as I go through the list, like I said, I'll go ahead and tell you what books that I really want to get to, hopefully this year or next year. So yeah, Carrie is definitely one that I haven't read, but I've seen the movie of, and it was a really good movie. It's obviously a classic, so definitely want to get to that one. The next one, Salem's Lot. I haven't read that one either. I am definitely going to get to that one hopefully in the next year because it is actually something that's kind of relevant to the Dark Tower series, which I'll get to in a little bit. But it's something that I'm going to be working on for a future video series. I have a hardcover version of this one, so I definitely want to get to that one hopefully the next year. So the next book is Rage, and this one's actually written as his pseudonym, Richard Bachman. I haven't read this one either. I haven't read any Richard Bachman books other than Thinner, which I'll be getting to here in a little bit. So that one's definitely one that I wanted to get to as well. Then we have The Shining, one that everyone, again, a huge classic, one that everyone knows about. I have both read this one and watched the movie for this one, so it is definitely one that I really appreciated, and it is one that I have read. The next book that he wrote in 1978 is The Stand. Again, I have read this one. I actually have an extended version, which has, I believe, 100 pages of cut scenes and descriptions that he's wrote about that doesn't show up in the original novel, and that does, I believe, get explained in the movie. I haven't seen the movie yet, although I really want to get to it at some point, but I have read the book, and again, The Stand is one that kind of is relevant to the Dark Tower series, so you'll probably see me talking about that in my future video. The next book that he wrote in 1978 was with his pseudonym Richard Bachman, and it is The Long Walk. Again, I haven't read that one. Then in August 1979, he wrote The Dead Zone. I have not read that one either, although I've heard a lot of really good things. Then in 1980, he wrote The Mist, which is actually a novella, and I have read this one, and I've also watched the television series that they put out. It's on Netflix right now. It was not a great television series, but it was a really good book. It was very short, it was very interesting. It was definitely a little creepy, so I would highly recommend that one. Then in 1980, he wrote Firestarter, again a classic. I have not read this one. In 1980, he wrote as Richard Bachman Roadwork. Again, one I haven't read. The copy that I have of this one actually is a Barnes & Noble one, the one that you can get at Barnes & Noble. It's like a newer version of it, so I haven't read that one. I also have that one in a collection of Richard Bachman books. It has, I think, 4 of his stories in it, so I kind of have 2 copies of it technically, but yeah, I haven't read that one yet. His next book, written in 1981, is Cujo. Again, haven't read it. I'm not super interested in it. I've heard a lot of kind of iffy things about it, that it's not that great. But I really want to read it so that I can watch the movie. I don't like watching the movies, any movie, before I read the book, and especially with Stephen King. I know that a lot of his movies are like very, very famous, like Pet Sematary, Cujo. You know, I think even The Dead Zone is a movie. I haven't seen a lot of his movies because of the fact that I really want to read the books first. So I haven't seen Cujo yet because I haven't read it. So that's the only reason why I really want to read Cujo, is just so I can watch the movie, just to kind of compare them and to kind of just appreciate how old they are. Okay, in 1981, he wrote as Richard Bachman, The Running Man. Again, I haven't read this one. Then in 1982, he wrote the first novel for the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger. I have read this one. I love it. Again, check out a future video series that I'm going to be putting out here on my channel. Then in 1982, he wrote the novella Apt Pupil. And I believe he rewrote this one, or he wrote a foreword to it, but I have read this one because he kind of re-released like a paperback version of it, and I did read this one. In 1982, he wrote The Body, which is another novella. I have not read this one. I don't own The Body, but I think it's in a short story collection. If it's not, I know that Barnes & Noble sells The Body as a standalone novella, so I'll definitely look into that, but yeah, I haven't read that one. Okay, 1982, he wrote The Breathing Method. I've never actually heard of this one. It is a novella. I don't know if it's an ebook or not, but I don't own this one, so I obviously haven't read it. And then in 1982, he wrote Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. I have not read The Shawshank Redemption, but I do own this one. It's part of a collection that I own here, so it's definitely one that I want to read, although I have seen the movie for it already. Still really want to read it. Okay, and then in 1983, he wrote Christine, which is a novel. Again, a classic. I don't think I've read Christine. I can't remember, to be honest. So if I did read it, it must not have been super memorable. So I probably should reread that at some point if I haven't read it already. So I'm going to say that I haven't read it only because I don't remember any of it. I know it's about a car. That's it. In 1983, he wrote Pet Sematary. I have read this one. I have seen both the original and the new adaptation that came out a couple years ago, and I loved it. Definitely a classic that's worth reading. Then in 1984, he wrote The Talisman. Have not read it, although it is pretty big. So I'm curious to read that at some point. Okay, in 1984, at Richard Bachman, he wrote Thinner. Now, Thinner was actually one of the first books that I've ever read. I think it technically is the first book, because I did want to read Desperation when I was in middle school. I had bought the hardcover at an antique store. I really appreciated it. I read like 50 pages in and was too freaked out, so I ended up stopping it and reading it in high school later on. But I ended up reading Thinner as like the first official book that I've ever read of Stephen King, and it was definitely one that I shouldn't have read when I was a kid. It was really freaky. It actually gave me nightmares. The funny thing, a funny story is that as I was reading it, I came to a scene kind of early on in the story, and I went to my mom and I said, "Hey, I don't know what this means. Could you tell me what it means?" And basically the scene was describing the wife. I don't remember their names, but the wife was, the wife and the husband were driving in the car like downtown, and the wife was like reaching over onto his lap and, you know, doing something while he was driving, and it was distracting him. And I was like to my mom, what is he doing? Like, why is he being distracted? And my mom was so like embarrassed and uncomfortable with telling me what was going on. Like, I don't think she ended up telling me because I was just too young to like understand that stuff, but it's just an early memory that I laugh about, and that I think it's just really funny that I was reading these kind of books when I was a kid, and it didn't like, I mean, yeah, it was scary, but it didn't bother me too much. It's just the fact that there were some things that happened in these stories that like I didn't understand, and so I either like asked my parents, or kind of like learned as I grew up what was going on, and I just think it's really funny. In 1985, he wrote the book Cycle of the Werewolf. I don't think I owned this one. It's funny, I thought I owned every book of his, but I actually don't think I own this one, so I'm definitely going to look into that one. Then in 1985, as Richard Bachman, he wrote the Bachman books. I do own this one. I believe this one is the short story collection that I own. Okay, 1986, he wrote the famous novel It. Now, I have not read it. I tried to read it, but it was just really dense, really long, and I've heard a lot of really uncomfortable scenes are in the book. So I haven't read it. I may read it one day. I don't know. But I have seen the original movie, and I've also seen chapter 1 of the new movies that just came out a couple years ago. I haven't seen chapter 2 yet, but I really want to. I might even see that this weekend or in the next week or two. So yeah, I definitely really enjoyed the movies at least, and I may one day read the book. In 1987, he wrote The Eyes of the Dragon. I have read this one. I've read this one twice, and it's really interesting because this one is technically the first book that he ever really kind of came up with the idea for Roland and the Dark Tower series. He obviously did write The Gunslinger earlier, but if I remember correctly, he wrote The Gunslinger, but he still didn't really know that it was going to become a series exactly. So it's interesting that like he kind of wrote Roland, and Randall Flagg, I believe, is in the story, and the kind of like a backstory of a sort of him as a child, but it's not technically .5 of the Dark Tower series. So I just thought that was a really interesting book. It wasn't that bad. I read this one a couple times. Then in 1987, he wrote The Drawing of the Three. So it's the second book of the Dark Tower series, and it's actually my favorite one out of all of them. So I obviously have read that one, really enjoyed it. In 1987, he wrote Misery. I haven't read Misery, but I'm really excited to, because I've actually, out of all of the like classic books that he's written, that one's one of the ones that I'm like the most excited about for some reason. Just because I know pretty much the entire story already before I even read it. But it's definitely one that I really want to get to as soon as possible, so I probably will read that one in the next year. In 1987, he wrote The Tommyknockers. I have not read this one, however, I do have a hardcover version of it, so it's definitely one that is interesting to me, and I'm really excited to read it. In 1989, he wrote The Dark Half. Now, from what I know, The Dark Half is actually an interesting story. I haven't read it yet, but it kind of is, it's like one of the books that he wrote towards the end of him being Richard Bachman. And from what I've heard from people, it kind of is like, it kind of depicts him and his like pseudonym kind of fighting each other, you know, kind of like him trying to figure out what kind of a writer he is, and it kind of personifies into this story. And I think that's really interesting, and it's actually going to be a part of another video series that I'm thinking of doing here in a little while about like Richard Bachman, as Richard Bachman, and how like The Dark Half is kind of like that accumulation of everything that he kind of goes through as writing as that person. So it's a really interesting concept to that story, and it's one that I really want to actually get to in hopefully the next year or so. Okay, so in 1990 he wrote the complete and uncut edition of The Stand, and that's the one that I own. So it's interesting that like he wrote that one quite a few years later, and that's one I actually own and really enjoyed. In 1990 he wrote The Langoliers, which is a novella. That one is actually part of a short story collection that I own, and I really enjoyed that short story, so I have read that one. He also wrote in 1990 The Library Policeman. I don't know if I've read this one. It might be part of a short story series as well. I know a lot of novellas that he's written are either short story collections now, or they're only ebook novellas that you can buy. So I'm not going to be completely sure about a lot of these novellas, but like I said, I'll keep track of which ones I've read and which ones I haven't read after I've edited this video. In 1990 he wrote Secret Window, Secret Garden. I'm almost positive I have read this one. In 1990 he wrote the novella The Sundog. Again, that sounds familiar, so I probably have read it, but I'm not sure. Then in 1991 he wrote the third book to the Dark Tower series, The Wastelands. That one was definitely the one that was getting me the most into the series. It's kind of describing a bit more of like the characters, and it really gets you involved in the worlds that they are in, that like the story takes place in. And I definitely was getting the most interested in what was happening at this point, and it's a really good book. I obviously have read it. I've read all the Dark Tower books. In 1991 he wrote Needful Things, which I have not read, although I have a hardcover version of it. Then in 1992 he wrote Gerald's Game. Again, one that I haven't read, although I know a lot about it. I pretty much know the ending already from hearing like Stephen King do like talks and stuff and conventions. Definitely one that I really want to get to. But yeah, I haven't read that one yet. In 1993, he wrote Dolores Claiborne. Now the reason why I wasn't sure if I've read Christine is because Christine and Dolores Claiborne, I believe, are kind of similar. I might be wrong with that, so don't quote me, but I don't know if, I'm pretty sure I haven't read this one. I might have read Christine. But again, I'm going to be showing the markers of like which books I've read and haven't read, so you'll know. I personally right now can't remember. In 1994, he wrote Insomnia. That one's another one that's kind of like loosely based with the Dark Tower series. It kind of goes back into like the backstory of one of the main characters of it. That's one that I have not read. However, it is on my most anticipated shelf over here. So I definitely really want to get to that one in the next couple months even, because that one's definitely one that I'm really excited to read. And then 1995, he wrote Rosemader. That one's not really one I'm super interested in. I own it, haven't read it yet, and I don't know, the description for it hasn't really interested me super much. But yeah, I haven't read it yet, and I will eventually read it. In 1995, he wrote As Richard Bachman, The Regulators, and this one's technically a companion novel with Desperation. So I'm hoping to be able to read, to do kind of like a special reading vlog as I read both of those books and kind of compare them as like him as Richard Bachman and as himself writing these stories that are like companions to each other. So I haven't read that one yet, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading that one. Okay, then throughout 1996, he wrote a bunch of, he technically calls them novels, but they're the Green Mile, so I believe there are 6 different Green Mile novels all in one. I actually have a paperback version of all of them together, so I haven't read that one yet, but I definitely want to, and I know that the movie's really good for that one. Then in 1996, he also wrote Desperation. I have read that one. As I had described before, I read that one as like, I think it was like the second or third book I've ever read from Stephen King, and I actually have a really nice hardcover version of that story. I believe it is the original hardcover for that, as well as The Regulators is the original hardcover for that, and I ended up buying both of those at an antique store, so I have a really fond memory of getting those. Then in 1997, he wrote the 4th book of the Dark Tower series, Wizard Glass. Again, read that one, loved it, was really getting enveloped in the world at that point. In 1998, he wrote Bag of Bones, which is a novel. I have read that one. In 1999, he wrote The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Haven't read that one, although I do own it, and I'm really interested in it. Then 1999, he wrote Hearts in Atlantis. So I have read those. And there is a short story in that collection that's technically 0.5 of the Dark Tower series. And it kind of goes through, like, I believe the nurses of the world that they live in. And so it's really interesting, and I highly recommend that one. There's a few other novellas that he wrote in 1999. He wrote Heavenly Shades of Night Are Falling, Low Men in Yellow Coats, and Why We're in Vietnam. I have read Low Men in Yellow Coats, but I don't know if I've read the other two, and I don't know if I own those. So in 2000, he did write the complete serial novel of The Green Mile. I believe that's the one that I own. In 2001, he wrote Dreamcatcher. I haven't read that one or watched the movie for it, but it's definitely one that I really want to get to in the next year. It's one that my mom actually had read. She hasn't read a lot, but she has read or watched the movie. I can't remember, but she knows of that story, and she like was highly recommending me reading that book at some point. And this was years ago that she said that, so I still really want to get to it at some point, and I own the paperback of it. Oh, I owned the paperback, but now I actually own a hardcover version of it. I just bought it recently. In 2001, he wrote Black House. Again, one I haven't read, although I have the hardcover version of it, and I'm really interested in it. In 2002, he wrote From a Buick 8. Again, it's a horror about cars. He's written so many of those, I feel like. I haven't read it. Sort of interested in it, not really sure, but I own the hardcover of that one, so. So in 2003, he rewrote The Gunslinger. He revised it, and I think that's when I had found out about it, but I still wasn't reading it because I was only 8 years old at that point. So yeah, he rewrote The Gunslinger in 2003, and he also wrote The Wolves of Calla and the Song of Susanna over the next 2 years in 2003 and 2004. Again, it's part of the Dark Tower series, and The Wolves of Calla was actually my least favorite of all the Dark Tower books, but the Songs of Susanna was definitely like on par with The Drawing of the Three, because it was like pretty much entirely based on the one character, Susanna, and I really loved it. It was really, really interesting. I have the paperback of it, although it's like a much bigger paperback than the other Dark Tower novels that I have, which is kind of funny, but I absolutely loved that book. And then in 2004, he wrote The Dark Tower, which is the last book of the Dark Tower series. Again, I've already read it, loved it so much. In 2005, he wrote The Colorado Kid. I actually just recently read that one, so he re-released it as a hard crime novel, I think, in the last couple years. And I actually just finished that one not too long ago. I didn't really enjoy it too much. I think I gave it 3 stars. But it was definitely an interesting one. It was definitely really different from what he normally writes. Then in 2006, he wrote Cell. Haven't read it, but I own it, so gonna get to it eventually. In 2006, he wrote Lacey's Story. And I actually just read that one like a week ago. And I'm currently watching the television series on Apple Plus right now. And I absolutely loved the story. I gave it 5 stars. and I'm very much enjoying the television series at the moment, so that's one that I'm really happy about, and I highly recommend that one. If you're actually interested in hearing all of my thoughts about the story as I went through the story, I actually have like a podcast video that I just put up on my channel a couple days ago, probably a week from when you're going to be seeing this video, so I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in knowing like very detailed thoughts about the story. There are spoilers throughout the story because I do go through the entire book, and there are definitely trigger warnings for abuse, self-mutilation, and mature content, so just be careful if you do want to listen to it, but it was a very, very good book, so I highly recommend it. In 2006, he wrote As Richard Bachman Blaze, and I believe that's one of the last books he ever wrote as Richard Bachman. I haven't read it, but I do own it. Then in 2008, he wrote Doma Key. I have read that one. I have it in hardcover, and that's kind of around when I started buying and reading his books as they came out. So it was definitely like, I don't know, it's really memorable for me to like kind of look back and see and say like, oh, from Doma Key on, I've read pretty much every book that he's written, almost. I also remember that one was really interesting because it takes place in the Keys, of the Florida Keys. And I thought that was really interesting because most of his stories take place in Maine. So it was definitely really different for him to have written in the Florida Keys, and it was a really good book from what I remember. In 2008, he wrote A Very Tight Place. He actually wrote a few novellas. He wrote A Very Tight Place, N, and UR between 2008 and 2009. I haven't read any of those, and I think they're all ebooks. I'm not sure, but I do want to get them at some point. Okay, so in 2009, he wrote Under the Dome. And if you've seen any of my original video or my older videos, you'll know that Under the Dome is my absolute favorite book. It's my favorite book that he's ever written. It's honestly one of the favorite books of all time that I've ever read. I have the original hardcover. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, it's kind of hidden behind my chair right now, but I have the original hardcover. It's really beat up because I've read it twice, maybe 3 times. I can't remember. But I read it a lot. I love it so much. It's such a good book. I don't know if the story is like the best story I've ever read, but I just love the book as itself. It's very long, and I read that one when it came out. I read it in high school. I was carrying it around everywhere with me, and it's so good. Then in 2010, he wrote Blockade Billy, which is a novella. I do believe I've read that one. In 2011, he wrote 11/22/63. Read it, loved it. I actually went to an antique store and bought like a pin for John F. Kennedy, and I put it on the book just because I loved it so much. So really recommend that one. Then in 2012, he wrote a novel that's technically 4.5 of the Dark Tower series. It's The Wind Through the Keyhole. It's basically Roland kind of going through a bunch of like childhood stories as he's talking with his friends. And it's really interesting, and it technically is part of the Dark Tower series, so I do own that one. In 2013, he wrote Joyland. Again, it was a hard crime, true crime story that he wrote. Read that one, really enjoyed it. It was actually the first true crime novel I've read from him. In 2013, he wrote Dr. Sleep. It is technically the sequel to The Shining, and I read it, and it was okay. It wasn't my favorite, and I do believe they have a television series or a movie, I can't remember which, that's out for it. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm really interested in it. So yeah, I read that one. And in 2014, he started the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. I believe it's called the Bill Hodges trilogy. I actually have all 3 books. You can kind of see them right here. But I have all 3 of the trilogy in like the original hardcovers of them, so I have read Mr. Mercedes. In 2014, he wrote Revival. That one was definitely a really different and interesting book that he's ever read, or that he's ever written, and I have read that one. Then in 2015, he wrote Finders Keepers, which is the second book of the Bill Hodges trilogy. I have read that one and loved it. In 2016, he wrote End of Watch. Again, that's the 3rd book of the Bill Hodges trilogy, and I read it and loved it. And it was really hard that I had to like wait a year in between every single one of those books because the story was just getting so much more interesting and really exciting. I really want to reread that at some point, and I might even do like a special vlog video for it. So if you're interested in that, please leave that down in the comments if you're interested in like hearing my thoughts as I reread that series that I like really loved. In 2017, he wrote Wendy's Button Box. I read that one very recently, and actually if you didn't know, he wrote the story, like half of it, years and years ago, and then he couldn't figure out how to end it, and he wasn't really sure if he like really enjoyed the story at this point, so he kind of like tabled it for a long time. And then a friend of his, Richard Chismar, kind of like wrote to him and said like, hey, I'd love to collab with you at some point if you have a story in mind. And so Stephen King kind of gave him Wendy's Button Box just to kind of be like, hey, do you want to do something with this? I have no idea what to do with it. and Richard Chizmar kind of came up with this like really interesting concept of like an ending for it. And so they ended up co-writing it together. And funny enough, and I'm sure I'll go through it at some point in the list, he actually had ideas for continuing the series and ended up becoming a trilogy. So the third book hasn't come out yet, but it's really interesting to see that like it's one of those stories that Stephen King didn't really know what to do with it, so he kind of tabled it, and he ended up bringing it back because he co-wrote it with someone. In 2017, he wrote Sleeping Beauties. I have not read this one. It's the one that he co-wrote with his son Owen King. So that's one I actually haven't read yet, but I obviously have the hardcover for. So I'm really excited to read that one, and I might end up trying to read that in the next year or so. Then in 2018, he wrote The Outsider. Now this one is a standalone novel, although it does have Holly Gibney, which is one of the main characters of the Bill Hodges trilogy, involved in it. She's like a main character in this story. Read it, loved it. And I technically consider this to be like part of that universe. It's like kind of a fourth book in a sense of the Bill Hodges trilogy, but it's focusing on Holly Gibney, of course. Then in 2018, he wrote the novella Elevation. I own that one in hardcover, and it was a really interesting novella. It was very short, but pretty interesting. And in 2019, he wrote The Institute. Again, I own it. I read it very soon after it was published, and one of my favorite books he's ever written. I really want to reread that one at some point. In 2020, he wrote If It Bleeds. It's a series of short stories, but it has, again, Holly Gibney in one of the short stories. It is actually the one that is called If It Bleeds. Again, I kind of consider that one part of that universe. And that short story was really good. There was one other short story in that collection that was really good. But overall, that short story collection wasn't my favorite. But I really enjoyed If It Bleeds as a short story. Then in 2020, he wrote Life of Chuck. Mr. Harrigan's Phone and Rat are all novellas that are part of the If It Bleeds collection. I really enjoyed If It Bleeds and Mr. Harrigan's Phone. The Life of Chuck was okay. It was kind of strange. And Rat was just not interesting whatsoever. So I definitely... I don't know, that short story collection was okay. Okay, and then the last two is Billy Summers, which is coming out in August, so August 3rd. So I haven't obviously owned that one or read that one yet, although once it comes out, I am definitely going to get on that immediately, and I'm very, very excited about that one. And then the last book that's on this list is Gwendy's Final Task, which is the third book of the trilogy that's coming out on February 15th of next year. And if you want to know the second book of that trilogy, it is Gwendy's Magic Feather, which is only written by Richard Chizmar. The Gwendy's Final Task is another co-write with Stephen King, Richard Chizmar. So I highly recommend that series, and I'm really excited to read that third book. Okay, so that is the full list of Stephen King stories. I obviously have shown you how many I have read and how many I still haven't read. And there's actually quite a few like novellas that I don't own yet that I really want to read at some point. So here's the final list of books that I've read and books that I own. So obviously it's not, I don't even think it's 50%. You'll see, I don't know, but you'll see exactly how much it ends up being. But I love Stephen King. I own all of his books, like most of all his books. And I really hope one day to be caught up with him, to be able to have read every book that he's ever written. I hope that you guys are as interested in Stephen King as I am. Definitely look forward to getting more content from me about Stephen King in the future. More podcast videos like the Lacey story, very specific videos based on Richard Bachman, on the Dark Tower series, Bill Hodges trilogy if you're interested in that. If there's any book specifically that you would really like to see a specific video on that Stephen King's written, please leave that down in the comments. And if there's a Stephen King book that you really love, please leave that down in the comments as well. I would love to talk with you about just, you know, fangirling over Stephen King and like your favorite book and kind of memories that you have had with Stephen King yourselves. So thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I don't know how exciting this was, but I enjoyed it very much because I just love Stephen King. If you enjoyed the video, please like it. Please subscribe if you're new and if you want to see more videos like this. And I really hope that you have a great day. Bye.